made was that Jesus was that anointed one who restored the promises made to Israel and then outworked them in this crazy new way. And yet then Jesus left, and he said it was a good thing because then the helper could come. And here we are in the gap between Jesus being here, the presence of God in human form, in anticipation of him returning, working out how we are going to live in between. And so what we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks in the lead up to Advent is exploring a few things about what it means to live as Christians in our postmodern world. So some of the concepts that have shaped the last step of our tour of Exile have come from a really great book, a book called Beautiful Resistance. There's a picture of it if the thing's working, which engages with what it means to be the modern church in a state of exile. And so for us, exile means living in the world as it is while waiting for Jesus to return and reunite heaven and earth so that things here on earth, as Jesus said, are as it is in heaven.
Come on.
Yeah?
Come on.
Yeah, there we go. And so that is actually, show us the cool book. Oh, it was there for a second. There it is, look at that. You know a book's good when someone's taken a photo of it next to a plant. You know, John Tyson, he's an Australian, which is actually quite nice. It's nice to read a book by someone that isn't American. No offense to Americans, but there's a lot of books by Americans. So, living in our current cultural context is tricky for so many reasons, and one of them is that the dominant culture that we live in actually shapes and forms us, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Like, we don't get to opt out from being part of the culture that we're in, and the culture that we're in shapes us and forms us. And the interesting thing about that is our cultural context isn't particularly interested in making people disciples of Jesus. In fact, some of the ways that our culture forms and shapes us actually forms us in ways that are counter who we are called to be as disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so over the next few weeks, we're going to look at a few themes that can help us to be faithful to Jesus in our postmodern world. Today, we are picking up on the themes of privilege and sacrifice. Next week, Dave is going to be talking about hunger and apathy, and then Amy is going to lead us into Advent by talking about cynicism and celebration. So it's kind of the perfect lead into Christmas. So to get into this privilege and sacrifice tension that we walk as Christians, let me start with a quote. It's this one right here.
Yes.
A sign of the maturity of a particular church is its ability to express the gospel anew within the culture or cultures of its people. This shows the deep wisdom of the church. When the gospel interacts with a culture, it supports what is good and wholesome in that culture, but it also challenges every culture to recognize what is incompatible with the gospel. That is a really profound quote about what it means to wisely interact with culture and affirm the things that are within our cultural context that are actually awesome, but challenge the things that are incompatible with the life that we are called to live as disciples. You can flick that slide off now. Is this working? It's not a...
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yo. Nope. Yeah. Should I change? I've just got a loud voice. Let's try this one. There you go. Okay. So we, if you haven't realised, and John pointed it out already, live in a really specific time in human history. Not just because of all the stuff that we're going through in relation to COVID and all the other sorts of things, but a really specific time in human history because we have just more than we've ever had. We have access to more than ever. Now, talking about privilege and sacrifice, I don't know, if you've been around the Christian circles for a while, you've probably had someone like show you stats about how much you have and how much other people don't have, and then you're meant to feel slightly guilty about it and go home and, I don't know, maybe eat less rice. I don't know, like, I really don't want to do that today. I really don't want to be like, hey, you have a lot, so therefore be good stewards. But at the same time, I want to be like, you have a lot, so be good stewards. But what I want to do is, instead of just looking at the stuff that we have, is look at how it's forming and shaping us, and what it means to engage with that privilege and think about how we can use it in a sacrificial way for the benefit of others. Our challenge is to apply the teachings and the invitation of the gospel so that we live in the world but we're not of the world. Like we are, like the exiles in the Old Testament and the Christians of the New Testament, we are meant to live in such a way that we demonstrate that we are part of a different story. And here's what we believe. We believe that Jesus' death and resurrection was both an invitation into eternal life.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we also believe that it's an invitation into the practice of sacrificial love. Yeah?
Yeah.
Like Jesus dying on a cross is not just an invitation into the life that is bought for us as a result of his atonement, but it's also an invitation into the practice of living sacrificially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
That is the Messiah that we worship. And we as his followers are not invited just into eternal life, but to be people who embody his sacrificial love for others, for our city, for our country, for our world. Hey, Freddie. Yep, that's right. Okay, but the danger is that we would be so shaped and informed by the unique privileges of our modern world that we forget about our calling to be, as Paul puts it, living sacrifices. Now, there are a bunch of framing stories and rituals that you can subscribe to in our world today. There are so many different opportunities and ideas and concepts that we can align ourselves to. And if we aren't careful, we can end up being formed by stories that are counter the gospel story.
Yeah.
And so basically what this talk is going to be is I'm going to read a few extended quotes from a bunch of different resources that I've found really helpful at naming this thing. I'm hoping that this will be an apocalypse for us. Apocalypse in the Greek meaning a revealing, helping us to see something with, afresh for the first time. So, can you change the slide? I'm going to read a quote from this book here. If you haven't read any of these series of books, J.K. Smith is a fantastic cultural commentator, and he comes from this beautiful Christian perspective, and so he helps us to see things that are difficult to see otherwise. So, let me read you a kind of long quote and just go on the journey, because he does this beautiful, beautiful thing. I would like to invite you for a tour of one of the most important religious sites in our metropolitan area. It is the kind of place that may be quite familiar to many of you, but my task here is actually to try and make this place strange. I will try to invite you to see it with new eyes, which will require a shaking off of the scales of mundane familiarity. This will require focused attention to detail. We're going to turn the camera gaze and let it hang on something you see all the time, but perhaps without seeing it or noticing it. So you might imagine that we are like Martian anthropologists who have come to this world, the strange world of the 21st century, in order to gather data on the rituals and religious habits of its inhabitants. Having made our way from Mars, equipped with the tools of ethnographic description, we are going to venture to one of our culture's most common religious sites and observe it with eyes that are focused on the religious aspects of its rituals. So join me as we approach the site. Is everyone with me?
Come on.
Okay, so the concept here is like we're foreigners to this culture, and we're just going to see it with brand new eyes and notice some things about it. You ready for this journey? As we're still off at a distance, I want you to notice the sheer popularity of the site, as indicated by the colourful sea of parking that surrounds the building. The site is throbbing with pilgrims every day of the week, as thousands and thousands make the pilgrimage in order to provide a hospitable environment and absorb the daily influx of the faithful. The site provides an ocean of parking, but the monotony of black tarmac is covered by dots of colours from cars and SUVs lined up row by row, patiently waiting as the pilgrims devote themselves to the rituals inside. Indeed, the parking lot constitutes a kind of moat around the building, since there are no sidewalks that lead to the site. The sacred building even provides a sanctuary from its incessant culture of automobilia. Some pilgrims make their way to the sanctuary, especially in winter, just for the space to walk. We've now made our way into the glistening sea of black in colour and found a haven for our vehicle. Still quite a distance from the sanctuary, other pilgrims join us as we begin to wind our way towards the building that sprawls in both directions and seems to be rising from the horizon, a dazzling array of glass and concrete with recognisable ornamentation. Indeed, because the particular religious site is part of the international Catholic, meaning universal, network of religious communities, the architecture of the building has a recognisable code that makes us feel home in any city. The large glass atriums at the entrance are framed by banners and flags. Familiar texts and symbols on the exterior walls help the foreign faithful to quickly and easily identify what's inside. And the sprawling layout of the building is anchored by large pavilions of sanctuaries akin to the vestibules of medieval cathedrals. That's a cool sentence. We arrive at one of the several grandiose entrances to the building, channeling us through a colonnade of chromed arches to the towering glass face, with doors lining its base. As we enter the space, we are ushered into a cathedral of sorts, intended for receiving, orienting, and channeling new seekers, as well as providing a bit of decompression space for the regular faithful to enter into the spirit of the place. For the seeker, there is a large map, a kind of worship aid, to give the novice an orientation to the location of various spiritual offerings and provide direction into the labyrinth that organises and channels the ritual observance of the pilgrims. One can readily recognise the regulars, the faithful, who enter the space with a sense of achieved familiarity, who know the rhythms of the heart because of habit-forming repetition. The design of the interior is inviting to an almost excessive degree, sucking us into the enclosed interior spaces with windows on the ceiling open to the sky, but none on the walls open to the surrounding car park. This conveys a sense of vertical and transcendent openness that at the same time shuts off the clamour and distractions of the horizontal, mundane world. This architectural model of enclosure and enfolding offers a feeling of sanctuary, retreat, and escape. From the entry, one is invited to lose oneself in this space, which channels the pilgrim into a labyrinth of octagons and circles, inviting a wandering that seems to escape from the driven, goal-oriented ways that inhibit the outside world. The pilgrim is also invited to escape from the mundane ticking and counting of clock time and to inhabit a space governed by a different time, one almost timeless. With few windows and a curious Baroque manipulation of light, it almost seems as if the sun stands still in here. We lose our consciousness of time's passing, and so we lose ourselves in the rituals for which we've come. However, while the daily clock time is suspended, the worship space is very much governed by a kind of liturgical festive calendar, variously draped in the colours and symbols and images of an unending litany of holidays and festivals to which new ones are regularly added. Since the establishment of each new festival translates into greater numbers of pilgrims joining the procession to the sanctuary and engaging in the worship. Has anyone noticed all the Christmas stuff that's already gone up? Oh my goodness. Anyway. The layout of the temple has architectural echoes that hark back to the medieval cathedrals, mammoth religious spaces that can absorb all kinds of different religious activities all at one time, and so one might say that the religious building has a winding labyrinth for contemplation, alongside of which are innumerable chapels devoted to the various saints. As we wander the labyrinth in contemplation, preparing to enter one of the chapels, we'll be struck by the rich iconography that lines the walls and interior spaces. Unlike the flattened depiction of saints one might find in stained glass windows, here is an array of three-dimensional icons adorned in clothing that, as with all iconography, inspires us to be imitators of these exemplars. These statues are icons that embody for us a concrete image of the good life. Here is a religious proclamation that does not traffic in abstract ideas or rules or doctrines, but rather offers to the imagination pictures and statues and moving images. While other religions are promising salvation through the thin, dry media of books and magazines and messages, this new global religion is offering embodied pictures of the redeemed that invite us to imagine ourselves in their shoes, to imagine ourselves otherwise, and thus to willingly submit to the disciplines that produce the saints evoked in the icons. Here again, we need to appreciate the universal nature of this iconography. These same icons of the good life are found in such temples across the country and around the world. The symbols and colours and images associated with their religious life are readily recognised the world over. The wide circulation of these icons through various mediums, even outside the sanctuary, invites us to make the pilgrimage in the first place. This temple, like countless others now emerging around the world, offers a rich embodied visual mode of evangelism that attracts us. This is a gospel whose power is beauty, which speaks to our deepest desire and then compels us to come not with dire moralisms, but rather with a winsome invitation to share in this envisioned good life. Yet one should note that it has its modes of exclusivity too. Because of its overwhelming success in convincing the nations, it's increasingly difficult to be an infidel. And it is a mode of evangelism buoyed by the transnational network of evangelists and outreach, all speaking a kind of unified message that puts other fractured religions to shame. If unity is the testimony to the religion's truth and power, it will be hard to find a more powerful religion than this global faith. And as we pause to reflect on some of the icons on the outside of one of the chapels, we are invited to consider what's happening within the chapel, invited to enter into the act of worship more properly, invited to taste and see. We are greeted by a welcoming acolyte who offers to shepherd us through the experience, but also has the wisdom to allow us to explore on our own terms. Sometimes we will cautiously, curiously, tentatively make our way through the labyrinth, within the labyrinth, having a vague sense of our need, but unsure of how it will be fulfilled. And so we are open to surprise, to that moment when the Spirit leads us to an experience we could not have anticipated. Having a sense of our need, we come looking not sure what for, but expectant, knowing that what we need must be here, and then we hit upon it. Combing through the racks, we find that experience and offering that will provide fulfillment. At other times, our worship is intentional, directed, and resolute. We've come prepared for just this moment, knowing exactly why we're here in search of exactly what we need. In either case, after time spent focused and searching in what the faithful call the racks, with our newfound holy object in hand, we proceed to the altar, which is the consummation of worship. While acolytes and other worship assistants have helped us navigate our experience, behind the altar is the priest who presides over the consummating transaction. And this is a religion of transaction, of exchange and communion. When invited to worship here, we are not only invited to give, we are also invited to take. We don't leave this transformational experience with just good feelings or pious generalities, but rather with something concrete and tangible, with newly minted relics, as it were, that are themselves the means to the good life embodied in icons who invited us into this participatory moment in the first place. And so we make our sacrifice, we leave our donation, but in return, we receive something with solidarity and solidity that is wrapped in the colours and symbols of the saints and the seasons, released by the priest with a benediction. Have a nice day. We make our way out of the chapel in a kind of denouement, a bringing together, not necessarily to leave, but rather to continue contemplation and to be invited into another chapel. Who could resist the tangible realities of the good life so abundantly and invitingly offered?
Ollies.
So it's a revealing of the process of going to a shopping mall, right? But it's getting at something far deeper, which is that ache which we talked about at the start of this Exile series, that we all have a sense that something is wrong. We all have a sense that there's something wrong with us and that there's something wrong with the world. And the Christian gospel has a story, has an answer as to what's wrong and what can help and what we're called to do to live in tune with the way that God is putting the world back together. Our cultural context has a bunch of answers about what is wrong and what you can do to help, what you can do with that ache that you feel. And the interesting thing to me is that in the last 50 years, so post-World War II, as we have become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier in the West, what we have done with our privilege is come up with more and more and more things that we can get that can fill that aching gap in our soul, and more elaborate molds that actually form us to return again and again. Shops and experiences which have actually convinced so many people within our culture that if I have enough and I get enough, then I will finally have the good life. that I see on the ads, that I see in the shops, that I see in the mall. And so what we can accidentally end up doing is using the privilege that we have to get more and more, so that we can get more and more, so that we can get closer to the dream. Add social media to that. I know this isn't everyone's generation, but we can project that we've got the good life while feeling like we absolutely don't have the good life, and being convinced that absolutely everyone else does have the good life. And in the middle of it, I just feel like God in his still quiet voice is going, come to me.
Yeah, come on.
My generation and the generations after me, but in some ways all of us, have been shaped and formed by the gospel of consumerism, which is only possible because of our privilege, and as a result we worship things. So what does it mean to follow Jesus in our privileged culture? The writer of Ecclesiastes actually understands this challenge all too well, and in a piece of brilliant ancient poetry, the writer points out what happens when we have everything that we could ever want but lose the ability to enjoy it. So I want to read a quote from Eugene Peterson's book, When Kingfishers Catch Fire. Can you check that one out? It is here, this book here. This is actually fantastic. This is a collection of 30 years of, so Eugene Peterson's the guy who wrote the message. It's a collection of 30 years of his sermons. He was just a pastor in a Presbyterian church, preaching every single Sunday for years and years and years. So that's fantastic. That's also his biography, which I'd really recommend reading. It's I cried. It was amazing. So I want to read a quote from this book, which is Eugene Peterson talking about our kind of cultural context, where we've arrived. He says this: the writer of Ecclesiastes believes that all joy, every pleasure, is God's gift. Our task is to find out how to enjoy the joy. Joys are profuse and various, but the capacity to enjoy them is questionable. Actual enjoyment of joy is sparse in our culture. Why? Because we don't actually enjoy the joy. As soon as we've got the thing, we're after the next thing. The capacity to joy is sparse. Reaching for or holding on to joy does not automatically convey the ability to enjoy. I've always been amused by the comment of the novelist Ellen Glasgow on her grandfather, a dour Presbyterian elder who never once committed a joy. But the writer of Ecclesiastes believes ardently in joy. He knows that our deepest likings and impulses are raw material furnished by God to bring us into the presence of God. But he also knows that they can be perverted and deflected into a way of life that leads to sheer boredom and cynicism. The intent of joy is to lead us to wholeness, but the way we engage in it frequently leads to malaise. The writer makes this point by role-playing the figure of King Solomon, who began as the wisest and ended as the most foolish of the Hebrew kings, who was in Ecclesiastes' day a shadowy figure of antiquity. In a skillful bit of role-playing, the writer assumes the character of Solomon to demonstrate joy gone wrong. So this is in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Solomon speaks, "Come now, I will make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself." Eugene Peterson says, I'm going to paraphrase the rest of this section, and I love how he does this. This is putting words into Solomon's mouth. "I'm going to pursue pleasure. I'm going to have more joy than anyone has ever had. The first thing I will do is organize the world around me to suit my taste. I will construct great houses so that I will have everything absolutely at my convenience. I will make vineyards and gardens so what I want to look at and what I want to taste will be completely under my control. I will fashion parks and pools so all the land and water around me will be just the way I want them. I will take absolute control by arranging everything exactly the way that I want it. The next thing I will do is turn everything into a commodity so I can use it my own way, and the most convenient way to do that is simply to multiply it. Each item will lose its individual quality and be under my control. I will multiply servants so each loses its identity and becomes a mere robot doing my will. I will multiply flocks and herds so they lose individuality and become simply food and clothing. I will multiply silver so that it's not a means for exchanging goods in personal relation with others, but will put my power and importance on display. I will multiply concubines so each woman loses personality and becomes an object for my personal pleasure. The world will be at my beck and call. Nothing has character in itself. I will be in complete control of every pleasure and everything. The environment will be shaped to my specifications and things will be under my control. The writer brings his little role play to a climax by having Solomon say, having arranged the world, I will indulge in it completely. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. And that exposes the fraud of the whole enterprise. What he sought to control now controls him. He loses the capacity to say yes or no, to choose or discriminate. He is swept into a, quote, orgy of indulgence. The world of pleasure that he has depersonalized so he could control it, now depersonalizes him. He began by arranging the world for his pleasure, and now he is part of the arrangement. He made pleasure into an idol he could use, and now the idol has a life of its own and it's using him. He has come under the control of the stimuli that he supposed he could control, and he is reduced to the level of Pavlov's dog, salivating at the sound of the bell of pleasure. He is a knee-jerk king, stupidly obedient to whatever his glands command. He is completely in the clutch of what I once heard described as gonadic determinism. What I find so deeply challenging about that quote is I think it describes our cultural context. It describes the world that we're living in. Anything that we see, we can have. Anything that we want, we can get. Like, it's kind of outrageous you can get tomatoes and blueberries in the middle of winter. It's kind of outrageous that you can get a Big Mac at 3 a.m, you know? Our culture has been tailored to go, you have privilege, use your privilege and your means to do stuff that makes you feel good whenever, however. And basically, as long as it's consensual and as long as no one gets hurt, you are encouraged to fulfill yourself by whatever means necessary. That is the cultural forces that is shaping all of us. And as Christians, if we're not careful, we can get really, really wrapped up in it. So those two quotes, I feel like, do a good job of kind of naming the water that we're swimming in. I've got 3 really short little things to kind of like lead us to a point of contemplation. My observation is that our privilege hasn't helped us to become the people that Jesus called us to be, and our privilege isn't helping us to become the people that Jesus is calling us to be. Jesus calls us instead to be living sacrifices. Hey bro, but if we aren't careful, we instead become faithful consumers. I want to say that again. Jesus calls us to be living sacrifices, but if we aren't careful, we instead become faithful consumers. Can you change the slide again, Catherine? So, if you've never read this book, check this out. This is another one to add to your reading list. This is a book by Neil Postman, written in 1984, called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And it's so fascinating. He's talking about the significant impact that technology is going to have on our world, and it's before the internet even existed, or before smartphones existed. And this is what he says in one of the most incredible introductions of any book ever written. He says, what Orwell feared, because he's comparing George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World, which are both great novels as well. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there'd be no reason to ban a book, for there'd be no one who would want to read one. I heard this quote yesterday, under 75% of Americans haven't read a single a work of literature each year. Like, there's no fear of reading books because no one would want to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much information that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we'd become a captive culture. Huxley feared we'd become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies. As in, how can I do something that's going to make me feel good? As Huxley remarked in A Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny fail to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Orwell added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In A Brave New World, they were controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we fear will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we desire will ruin us. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become trivial. Orwell feared what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love would ruin us. When you have a lot and you can get stuff that you like, that you desire, that tastes good, that looks good 24/7, it's very, very easy to be sucked into using our privilege like that. In a world where it's surrounded by products and entertainment, it's very easy to use our privilege to pursue the good life, and yet Jesus calls us to something very different. I want a little piece of poetry which I think is beautiful. This is by the poet W.H. Auden in his phenomenal poetic work, The Age of Anxiety, which is a critique of the promises of modernism. He says this: "We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die." So, with all of this, sort of like trying to reveal the forces that are shaping us in our culture, I want to finish with a really well-known scripture, but hopefully in this context it will kind of like convict us in a new way. So it's in Matthew 16, and here's what happens in the lead up to it. Jesus has asked the disciples, he said to them, "Who do you think I am?" And Peter's had this brilliant moment where he goes, "You're the Messiah, you're the anointed one. You're the one who's here. You're God incarnate. You're going to redeem things." And Jesus is like, "Yes, don't tell anyone." That's what happens. And then Jesus goes on to talk about what the Messiah does. And he goes on to say, "I am going to suffer and die. I am going to become a sacrifice." Jesus is telling the disciples how God is going to go about redeeming the world. And Peter takes Jesus aside and he goes, "No, you're not. That's not what a Messiah does. A Messiah wins. A Messiah comes out on top. A Messiah is like the kings of old who have all the like flash stuff. You're going to be in charge. You're amazing. You're not going to suffer and die." But Peter doesn't understand the way that Jesus and God do the redeeming work. And it's not by using our privilege to benefit ourselves. It's by using our privilege sacrificially for the benefit of others. In Philippians 2 it says, Christ didn't count his being on the level with God and use that for his advantage, but instead handed that in and submitted himself to death, right? And so following on from Peter being, "Get behind me, Satan," this is what Jesus says to his disciples. And I think this is to us as well as his disciples now. He says, "You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" So in our politically privileged culture, what does it mean for you to pick up your cross and to be a living sacrifice? What would it mean to sacrificially live in such a way that costs you for the benefit of others? What would it look like to resist the framing stories of our culture that tell us that we should invest our time and energy and money into pursuing our own happiness and instead live in such a way which costs us but benefits others? What does it look like for sacrifice to resist privilege? And so I've thrown out a bunch of different thoughts. It's basically recommended a whole bunch of different resources as well that you can engage with. But I think this thing here is the challenge that our community is actually taking up wholeheartedly. When we have moments where people take their money and buy groceries for other people and it shifts the culture in a school, we are tapping into this thing that Jesus has invited us into. When we have Sundays and we don't gather to top up our own tanks, but instead we take what's going on for us already and we go and serve the community, we're doing something that is beautiful and that it costs us, and then it's that inverse thing where you do something to benefit someone else and you actually end up feeling amazing about yourself anyway. That's the kind of upside down way that God seems to work. And so this is the challenge that we are invited into again and again, both individually and as a community, is what does it look like to not do just what's good for us, but what's going to potentially cost us for the benefit of others. And when we do that, I feel like we are stepping into Jesus' calling for us and for his inbreaking kingdom. Amen. I'm going to hand over to Amy.
you. Just as we take a minute, what is the thing that the Holy Spirit is highlighting for you? A couple of thoughts. Are you enjoying the joy? Is there a sense within you that the joy of Jesus would attract others and go, what are you so happy about? Are you enjoying the joy? That's one thought. Has what